So what we've tried to do is to put some of that energy and that positivity that we've always channeled through NextGen into a new series of events, to webinars like this, but we're hoping to have some other things coming your way soon, which we will look forward to shouting about on Twitter. And so this is our first go using a virtual platform, and we're just so grateful to Nick and Oliver, who have agreed and offered to spend some time with us this evening. It's always going to be tricky to capture some of the sort of magic we get in the rooms at NextGen, but what we're trying to recreate here is the kind of honest, relaxed conversation with some pretty inspiring people about the way they are leading and working at the moment, and the way they see that looking from their position, with a hope that we can start to share together some of the opportunities that a sort of unprecedented situation like this outbreak provides, as well as the challenges that inevitably brings to leadership at every level, from on the wards, in the practice, to the leaders who are working nationally to try and respond to this crisis. So that's what we're hoping to do through these events, and as I say, we couldn't start off with a better pair. I'll let them kick off in just a moment, but first I wanted to go through some sort of practicalities, some background rules, some technical things. The next set of thank yous, very briefly, is to thank Nish Manik, who has been instrumental in setting this up, along with James Waldron, who's one of our NextGen leaders in Nottingham, and Emma up in South Yorkshire, who have been really critical in getting the tech working for us. Thank you. So the timings for tonight, we started a little late to allow everyone to clap for those essential workers who are keeping everything going at the moment. We're going to aim to be done at about 9:15, 9:30, but of course if we need to go before then, we understand. We will share the video of this discussion on our website as soon as we can, and we will also keep a record of all the questions that come in, and if we can't answer them all tonight, we'll find a way to get Nick and Oliver back into the same virtual room in future to tackle those. So some technical things briefly. Please do, we hope that you will automatically have your videos and your audio muted. That feels counterintuitive to our open way of trying to discuss things and share things in NextGen, but just for keeping things practical as our first run, we are keeping videos and audio off. If you would like to ask questions, please do. We want this still to be very interactive, so use the chat function to send questions. They're coming through to me, and I will put them to Oliver and Nick after they kick things off for us. When you send your questions, please do give your name, your role, and where you are, because that will allow us to visualize you in your living room or your practice or wherever you happen to be at the moment. There are two views on Zoom. Most of you will know there's a gallery view and a speaker view. The speaker view we think is probably preferable. It should be the automatic function, but if it's not, you can toggle between them. We have a Twitter handle for tonight, which is #NextGenWebinars. Please do tweet along learning points as you go. I know we will try and share them as we go. But if you're able to watch and tweet us, then please do. That would be a great way of sharing some learning to those who can't join us here and now. Finally, at the very end, we will have a very brief evaluation form. I'll share the link for that on the chat, and we'll send it out as well. It's a good way of us keeping an eye on how we can do things better next time, because as you know, we've got another session coming up on the 6th of May with Hannah Miller, which is going to be special. So we want to learn from that and make any changes as we can in flight. So I'm going to stop waffling now until the questions start coming in. All of you, I suspect, will know Nick, Professor Nick Harden, who speaks at almost all of our events and was instrumental in setting up NextGen, a GP initially in Birmingham and now working in various practices as Chief Medical Officer for Operose Health. And Nick's had a range of regional and national and international leadership roles, from Sandwell West Birmingham CCG, which was award-winning CCG when they became a thing, to a special advisor to NHS England, helping really iterate and describe primary care networks, which have obviously been a big policy shift. So we're really grateful to have Nick's experience Oliver is a close friend of Nick and a close friend of NextGen. He's an executive coach and chair of Equitas Resources. He has spoken to several of our NextGen groups and Young Conference several times and offers an incredible insight, I think, into how we think and work as leaders and develop. And I know that he and Nick have a very special relationship in that regard. So I'm really grateful for them both for giving up their Thursday evening to talk to us. And guys, shall we assume we haven't got 137 people watching? Why don't I hand over to you to kick off the conversation?
Hey, thanks, Will. That's a big introduction. I'm always worried that big introductions usually lead to big failures afterwards. So we'll try and do our best. Thankfully, we've got Oliver, so we might be all right with this. So, I mean, what a great opportunity, isn't it, really, for us to think about the topic of leading in times, and uncertainty and crisis, because we've certainly got one of those going on. And so when you kind of suggested we did this, I thought it'd be really great to have an informal, conversational type learning event. I'll probably say some things and then Oliver will say something wise and you can write down what he says, which will be fine. But we wanted just to be able to have a relatively informal conversation so that you can just hear what our conversations are like quite a lot of the time in reality. So yeah, that's what we're aiming to do. So that's me. Oliver, did you want to say something else to kick off?
Well, really great to be here, and just a huge thank you to all 141 who logged into this. The desire and hope of my heart really is that both through what's discussed tonight as well as through the questions, that all of us are able to take something away that can be of some practical benefit to us as leaders in these times that make such huge demands on us. So I suppose maybe a way to start is, Nick, to say these challenging ways, I mean, unprecedented has become almost overused these days, unprecedented time. How are you thinking about and doing leadership, by way of kicking us off?
I guess, so I think the word unprecedented is certainly being overused, but I see it as not really unprecedented actually, but more like the unique challenge for our generation. I may get a chance to talk about my relatives, and some of you may have heard about how viral illnesses have affected my family previously, but I've been really struck by how we are dealing with a disease which also is causing dis-ease. Do you like my little pun on words there, Oliver? Did you get that? Disease and dis-ease. And what's really interesting, I think, the leadership role in some ways is to say, yes, there's all the activity we've got, and rightly so dealing with the disease, but how are we dealing with the dis-ease? It's like when our children were small, you could always scare them if they realised there was like a monster in the room. And the monster was never real, a bit like Monsters Inc. And the monster that is there. And one of the things is that people are pretty scared because we can't define the monster. How big's the monster? How steep's the curve? Have we hit the maximum time yet? And this really difficult thing of seeing great numbers of people dying. So I've been really struck by how someone wise, probably you, Oliver, told me that one of the jobs is to do two things. One is to look for truth and hope, and to do those two things together. And, as a leader, I'm trying to be truthful in where we are. I have a daily call with all the practice managers, some of the staff, some of the GPs, where we start off by just talking about the numbers. We're being truthful about what's going on out there. We're not shying away from the truth, but also talking about hope and trying to bring some hope to that situation, because I think you need both.
That's really interesting, because it's so tempting in times like this, as opposed to try and happy talk your way out of difficulty, and that doesn't work. Equally, to depress everyone, the sense we're not going to come out of it. Is there a practical example of a setting where you were recently that you can tell us about, where you had to do this with staff? colleague?
Yeah, so we run practices across the whole of England, and so I will go and visit them at different times. And last week, I was actually doing a surgery up in one of our practices a bit further away from Birmingham, and because I go, then the staff expect me to speak to them and say something to them, and there's that ominous moment where I haven't quite prepared anything wise or sensible to talk about, and so I'm sitting there thinking, well, what do I need to do? And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm doing the surgery, then thinking I've got to do truth and hope. So how do I do that? And I've really been struck previously where the leadership challenge often is to first, imagine a better future and then tell that story of a better future, or just by telling story, you can create hope in people. So maybe I will now talk about my grandfather. My grandfather lived through the 1957-58 pandemic, which was the Asian flu, and then my father was a doctor in 1968-69 through the USA pandemic, and so I'd had the privilege of talking to both of them. My father is still alive, my grandfather wasn't, about what it was like. And I remember, my grandfather was the DPH for Manchester and then Kidderminster. Kidderminster's a small, it's not small if you live in Kidderminster, and somebody living from Kidderminster will give me a right or ear bending in a minute. But so Kidderminster's about half an hour from us to the west of Birmingham. And so he would live in a bungalow. And I remember he was about 91 in this story. And so I told the story of me going to see him, and he was, I'd never ever not seen my grandfather in a shirt and a tie and what he would call a pair of slacks or some suit trousers. And so he rang me and said he's not very well, and I was a young GP then, so I still think I'm a young GP now, but there we are. And so this was probably 15 years ago. Went over to his house, drove over to Kidderminster to see him. He said, "Would I go and see him?" And the first thing that struck me is he came to the door in a dressing gown, and I could describe that paisley pattern of that dressing gown because I'd never not seen him in a shirt and a tie. And he came to the door, and so I thought, right, this is my chance to prove to him that the legacy of his, doctoring, I've taken on a good job, and you know what it's like when you're trying to be a doctor to a family member. It's it's tricky because there's a whole bunch of different things. But he was keen that I saw him, so I listened to his chest and did all the things, looked in his throat, and I said to him, "Grandpa," which is what I called him, "Grandpa, I think you've got the flu, and I think you'll get better, runny nose, sore throat." And it was that kind of season. And he looked at me and he stopped, and I remember his face. He looked at me and he smiled, and he said, "I don't think I've got the flu. Are you sure you're right?" And I was like, "No, I think you got the flu." And I was just like, "No, I don't think you got the flu." And so I said to him, "No, I think I do." And so we had this sort of semi-banter backwards and forwards of me feeling slightly like I'd already let the name down of being a doctor. And he just stopped and he said to me, "So we had the flu in 1957-58, and I remember if you drove down the road or you went everywhere, there were just dead people at the bus stop. When you drove here," he said to me, "were there dead people at the bus stop?" And there was that moment of wisdom trumping youthful stupidity, which is what I had at that moment. And him basically saying, not did I see dead people at the bus stop, but what was going on in the environment around me? Was that real? Did it fit in with what was going on? Because he lived through it. He lived through many things like that. And so I chose to tell them the story, and then talk then about my grandfather going on and living several more years. And what I was trying to do in describing hope is to say, my father's lived through this episode, my grandfather's lived through episode, and your great-grandfather, because there was another episode at the end of the Second World War. And to say, we will get through this. There will be a new day where COVID isn't the number one thing that we talk about. So bringing perspective through story, bringing hope and saying, actually, or celebrating the very minor stories. Sorry, Oliver, I'm waffling. Is that the right answer?
It's good. And isn't it interesting how story helps us make sense of our lived experience? I mean, one of the things that comes to mind, you might remember the Stockdale paradox, because that's one of the things that comes to mind.
I'd love to say I did, but I'd be blatantly lying. So, tell me some more.
Was the highest decorated prisoner of war, American prisoner of war during the Vietnam War, and so people have called what he did, his posture, they've called it the Stockdale paradox. Not a million miles away from what your dad and granddad were doing in medicine. And he said this. He said, retain the faith that you will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. And
hold on, I need to get a pen and a piece of paper out. I've got to redo what? Retain the faith.
It says, retain the faith that you will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. And this is a guy not writing from his lounge. He's writing from his Vietnamese prison. Retain the faith that you you prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. And then he says, this is where the paradox comes in. He says, and at the same time, confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they are.
Okay.
And it seems to me there was something of that, but what in what your father and grandfather were imparting to you.
And when you say, just help me understand, retain the faith, because that sounds, you presumably don't mean a religious connotation to the word faith. You mean something more important than that.
Your thing about truth and hope, when you're talking about truth and hope, what are the alternatives? The alternatives are despair and fear, and these have such a way of ripping a hold of us. And he didn't want them getting into despair, but he didn't want them getting into fanciful, baseless hope either. And interestingly, he said that those that didn't make it were those who were super positive about the thing, saying we'll get out by Easter. So I think for me, one of the challenges.
Oliver, you're on mute.
Okay.
Oh, that's better. Go on. Yeah. One of the challenges. Yeah.
One of the challenges for me as a leader is how do I lead myself in times like this? Because it's catching. Fear is catching. Hopelessness is catching.
Yeah.
So I think that's something for us as leaders to be thinking about, to say, when did I do my best job in terms of leading myself such that fear and despair did not define me.
Yeah. I'm just making notes. Fear and despair did not define me. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you're seeing, in some ways, so, just seeing patients. I've had conversations with staff. I had a guy who's a relatively new recruit to the ambulance, who went through the recruitment process as I held his hand in reality. But he's he's like 6'5", massive guy, seen many stories of life, and just he rang me a week or so ago. He's like 8 weeks into being a paramedic, fully trained, and he just rang me saying, Nick, it's really scary driving ambulances around Birmingham because of the people that you're picking up, and I don't know what I'm going to catch. And here's a guy who I thought would never be afraid of anything. In reality, I'd probably be more scared of him than anything else, because he's I'm 6'3" and he's 6'5", and people that are bigger than me, I'm like, whoa. So I think it's really helpful, isn't it, that the way we get through, I'm sure many of us are dealing with people that are just scared of what the possibilities are. And, you could argue, could rightly so, for some people. And so, and that's why we've got shielding, isn't it, to try and protect those people and things. So, I think it is, it's a tough season, isn't it? But where we can bring the opposite, it seems to be helpful. And so, for me, thinking about truth
and the effect it has on us. I mean, for me, one of the things that happened at the start of the coronavirus happening to us around the world is that one of my businesses we got into such difficulty that I had a supplier phone me and saying, I'm taking you to court, and they meant it, and it was in another jurisdiction. And I remember waking up with a cold sweat at night. Where's this going to end? And the sense of loss of control, and I had to say to myself, get a grip. Even before the answers arrived. So again, this thing of fear and despair, they want to rob you of any sense of peace and perspective.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, I'm thinking in terms of the what Stockdale I read, and I don't know what his first name was, you told me earlier, but thinking in terms of that, it's like actually confronting the brutal reality. So often, I've had nights where I haven't slept, and in the nighttime things are way worse, aren't they? And then just writing down, for me, the brutal reality of what things could be, but then realizing that a new morning comes and things are often perceived differently. Now, that doesn't change the fact that your business will have struggled or won't have struggled, but there's some processing that, which is in ways confronting the brutal facts and being truthful, but also trying to find hope in that as well.
Yeah, and for me, in that case, it was a question of small amounts having huge implications. I mean, this was maybe a mere $50,000 that had implications for millions, and so you have the risk of small things that can actually become monsters in the imagination, and our imaginations are not well known for being accurate, are they? And so
yeah, that's a great phrase. Our imagination. Yeah, no, I agree completely. Yeah.
So we've talked about the Doncaster story that you've talked about, and you've mentioned to me previously that there's this thing you've been mulling away around cocoon and that sort of thing. Do you want to tell us a little bit what that's about? And
yeah, so the other thing that really helped me was because my job is I'm only patient facing a day a week, so the rest of the time I'm on lockdown like everybody else. So I'm sitting in this room, computer screens, and doing all the things that everybody else is doing. And I heard someone saying, that when would you get the opportunity to do ever what a caterpillar does, where you actually get to lock yourself in a way in a cocoon thing. And sometime we'll come out, we will come out of this. And just even chatting around just the dinner table with the family that I've got here, we're saying, there are some people that are going to come out of this having drunk every night, having eaten rubbish all the time, done no exercise, with a slightly more stone than they expected to be carrying. Whereas there are some people that will be absolutely ripped that come out of their time in isolation, because they'll say, well, I'm going to do exercise and those things. And I thought it was really helpful for me when I started thinking about that, saying, caterpillars don't get the choice of going into a cocoon, and they don't get the choice of what, genetically it's decided what they'll come out as. But I can't, when I'm in my room, I get the choice as to, rather than having to get up and go on a train at 6 o'clock, I can get up now a bit later, and that means, or I can use that time differently. And so me taking control of the my confined situation involves me saying, well, I am going to define what kind of the things that are important to me, but then also kind of that's the first layer. And then there was also, for me, letting myself realize that it wasn't going to be the time where I learned to play a new musical instrument. It wasn't going to be the time where I got to write my new book, because I might have more time at weekends and that sort of thing, because again, just the emotions involved in dealing with what we're dealing with and dealing with others means that the creative bit of my brain isn't there to obviously my creative bit of my brain's here as I've described it, but that's not, it's not I'm not going to be able to do that in this time, whereas I might have some ideas of things that we can put down. And so being able to accept the fact that I'm my emotions are going to be fairly wrung out with all the people that I'm dealing with. And so then saying, actually, but I can change the way I think about things. And so whilst, I get the choice, I'm unlikely to come out ripped from this experience. I don't have enough weights in the house. But I will, hopefully I won't come out heavier, but I do get the choice to come out in how I believe about things and how I believe differently and how I choose to, what I cast my mind over. You've certainly got a spectacular set of books behind you. I've got a set of books beside me. I'm saying, actually, I'm going to choose to do just a bit more reading. Therefore, my thinking is going to be better. And so I get to choose to reset my habits and choose to think about what I'm going to stand for and what I'm going to fight for. So that's been, just that cocoon thing's been helpful for me in terms of saying, I get to choose what I do in my cocoon. I'm not, I can be active rather than passive.
That's very powerful. That's very powerful. For me, part of what that puts me in mind of is the thought of the notion of self-care that I struggle with and other leaders struggle with, where self-care in that cocoon setting is crucial, and yet we can feel like it's a self-indulgence.
Yeah.
And so practically what are some of the ways that self-care might be practiced? I think one of the things is our morning rituals. I don't know about the others that are in this conversation, but for me, if I'm not careful, when I wake up in the morning, the first thing that comes into my head are the problems I need to solve, the targets I need to hit, and the things that might go wrong. And so what I'm trying to experiment with is telling my brain what to focus on for the first 15 minutes. So, for example, where I might actually say, in the horrendous times of this last week, what couple of things have gone well, and how do I understand them better, and how have my strengths and resources contributed to that, and is there any way I can sharpen that more? So that there's this sense of trying to connect with where I have contributed. None of us wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to mess up today. And yet few of us celebrate or at least recognize the things that we contribute well. So to me, the control thing that you mentioned also being a little bit like the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. So part of what I'm trying to do in the morning is to say, how do I transform my thermometer status into a thermostat status? In the sense that a thermometer registers the temperature, reports it accurately, and stays there.
Yeah.
But because a thermostat is plugged into a source of power, it sets about shifting it to where you set it at. So just a couple of thoughts.
So what is so I've got my my morning ritual consists of waking up and looking what's on my iPhone and not doing what you've just done. And thinking, here's the emails I haven't done, and here's it. So presumably you don't do that. You do something that's a bit different.
The temptation is huge. Let's say maybe 3 times a week.
Just so I don't get into trouble, there are other phones available. I know that you've got to be slightly careful with branding, so I'm sure there are other great phones. Just not that I'm saying what I have, but
but also there's a thing of not, unless you're on call, not putting your phone by your bedside. I mean, there are a few, really simple things. Or someone suggests even putting your phone in another room if that's possible. And so I think there's some leadership hygiene things that we can do for ourselves.
Okay. And so then do you? I don't know the answer to this, but do you list good things and bad things, or what do you do? What does that look like for you?
I look back and I say, in the last week or the last month, what things have worked well in line with what I hoped would happen.
Yeah. So
3 is enough, and then trying to make sense of that. And then how have my few strengths made a contribution to making that happen?
Yeah.
I'm a man of very limited strengths, but the few that I have, I want to be intentional in using them well.
Yeah.
So then I might say, what one thing did not work as well as I might have liked, and what's my understanding of that, and how do I learn from it?
Yeah.
And so that it doesn't feel like one is trying to be Pollyannish. Yeah. And then to build on that going into the day, going into the week, I think the thing of perspective is really important. My suspicion is that many of the people with us tonight, before this, were people who had the perspective of thinking maybe 1 month, 2 months, 3 months ahead. And relative to what we are forced to do now, that's fairly strategic. Now we are forced to be like day traders. And so where the main focus is surviving the day, and that's understood. But within that, there's something about stepping on the balcony a bit.
So day traders being people that
in the world of investment, day traders are not strategic.
Okay. Yeah, got it. Yeah. So
it's the here and now.
Forgive my financial ineptness. Cool. Yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you. It's so good. I love chatting to you. I always have done, and it's such a privilege. We've known each other, I think, for nearly a few many years, and I just find the ability to chat to you is such a great relief. But there were at least 100 other people listening, so it feels like we should ask others if they want to interact with us, ask questions. So I think Will's in the background somewhere. I can't see him, but I know he's around. So I'm hoping that here he is.
The place to lurk. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Thank you both. I've had some good messages coming through. Hannah Morgan was pointing out that this is also a chance to break the mold, and that requirement to experiment. She pointed out NextGen being forced onto online platforms as one example. But I know that lots of people are finding that with the pressure comes an opportunity to innovate quite quickly. I had a question from Gautam, a GP in London, who was picking up on the paradox that Oliver was discussing around retaining the faith versus confronting the facts of the brutal reality, which is a phrase I need to use more often. But Gautam asked, how do you do that? How do you discuss truth and hope without spreading falsehood in such an uncertain time? We don't know how long this is going to last. We don't exactly know the characteristics of the virus we're trying to manage, and therefore information is changing quite quickly. So how do you go about being that beacon of trust for your team? When there must be uncertainty within you around where you're going and what you're trying to do.
Perhaps before Nick and I address that, can I come to some of what Hannah said just now?
Yeah, go for
it. So Hannah talked about breaking the mold. One of the things that I discovered during this time, a phrase I wasn't familiar with before, is a psychological phrase, which is normalcy bias. So, and normalcy bias is about so underestimating a crisis that you under respond or overreact. And there are some people that I'm listening to who say things will never be the same again. But lurking behind those words is normalcy bias. What they're hoping for is that it will return to the same normalcy as we had before. And so, it was just a comment on that thing that Hannah said. As for the question around confronting the brutal facts, I think there are times when vision can be really, really difficult, but values and purpose will always be present. And so...
Write that down. See, Will's writing that down.
So especially you guys are taking care not just of our physical well-being, you're taking care of our mental and psychological well-being, because and what amazing purpose, what amazing mission, what amazing values, the values of NHS. So to me, where distant vision is not possible, focusing on and being preoccupied with the mission, the purpose, and the values can be really helpful.
Can I answer that question too, Will? Am I allowed?
Please, Nick. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I think the thing about the truth is that you don't have to have all the facts. What you mustn't do, there's a difference between having the truth and the facts. So what I think I said was, you know, today there were, I haven't got the exact number in front of me, but normally I would do, there was, you know, this many deaths, it was this number, that's a concrete fact. How many deaths there'll be tomorrow, you know, I'm not going to talk about that because that's not truth. And so there is the truth of, you know, we're all trying to work remotely. This is how this disease is affecting us. We do have some truth about where we are, and you can, you know, or actually saying, there's a phrase which, you know, a famous leader that I listen to says, you don't always have to be right, but you have to be right about the things that you think you're talking about in terms of truth. And so if you ignore the truth, then you end up in a really difficult place, because it's like, well, it's not really bad, people aren't really dying, you know, those things are wrong. It is truthful that, you know, we're getting to the stage where probably if we could get everybody on this call, we know we're one step away from somebody that knows somebody that's died as a consequence from this. Now that's a truth. I can't prove it to you, but it's a truth. And so to not acknowledge that is, everybody sees it. It's like as soon as you're talking, everybody knows. And so it's like, just acknowledge the thing, just talk about what's the elephant in the room early on. Now, you may not be able to describe all of it, but being truthful about where that is, I think is really, really important. But then like you can't then leave people in the, you've got to talk about, and what are we doing? So, you know, what are you doing about that? So for us, you know, we're having regular calls, we're empowering people. We made sure we got laptops so that people could work from home to protect people who weren't needed. We arranged for the people that could work from home to work at home. And in our organisation, we said, well, actually, if you're not working at home, how does that make you feel if you're a receptionist? So we've found a way to fund breakfast and lunch for those people. Now, we haven't dealt with coronavirus because we can't, but what we have done is say there's some hope in these things. They're little things, but there's some hope there. So you can still talk about the truth without having the totality of the facts, because there is some truth that we do know.
That's very good. And within that, I suggest there's also something about the importance of giving voice to people's unspoken fears.
Yeah.
So things like some of you might be concerned about.
Yeah.
And speaking the truth that you is talking about into that, even if the facts are limited.
Yeah.
That's something I've been coming across, is that it can be quite hard to be that, to bring that hope when inside you're feeling quite uncertain and anxious.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's, you know, we're hearing about the importance of compassionate leadership and open and transparent leadership. We see that role modelled from some pretty phenomenal leaders in healthcare in this country. But
what are the dangers?
Where do you leave yourself there? Yeah.
What are the risks and dangers of compassionate leadership? Especially when we don't have self-compassion, we just spend ourselves and live a life of constant exhaustion. So compassion needs to cut both ways, where we're saying, if I'm going to serve these people, I need to make sure I'm serving them from a place of some strength at least.
And I would also say, Will, you know, there have been things recently where I've started a conversation by saying, you know, I'm just going to tell you a story of the guy that I told you about, the ambulance worker. And that made me, you know, he rang me, he burst into tears, you know, a big guy crying on the phone, and I cried on the phone with him. I didn't try, and the truth is, that's what I felt. So, and people go, this guy's real. You know, when they're talking about me, it makes me, I didn't do it because I'm trying to create a situation where I was falsely telling story. But actually, if you, you know, if you feel uneasy, then just owning that and stating that's completely real, completely reasonable. You know, you know, a sentence that starts, you know, gosh, you know, these are unprecedented times, use that unprecedented word again, but what's really interesting is how people are feeling, and I'm feeling like this. I'm feeling like I know there's a future, I know things are going to be, I know general practice has changed and we're hoping it's going to change, but at the moment, you know, I woke up this morning and I felt that I didn't feel as great, and so that, but owning that, and then people, and there's nothing, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that as a leader in reality. Now you can't stand up and bawl your eyes out in front of everybody and appear an absolute wreck. You know, that's that, people expect, they do expect more than that. But you owning your, you owning that's really important in terms of showing compassion.
I suppose much in the same way we do as clinicians when we break bad news with patients. So I guess
Exactly.
we all get experience of that, more so recently perhaps. Can I, Liam, who's a GPST1 in Cambridge, has brought up a really interesting division that I think, so he says, earlier this week, someone described the most effective strategy for leading in a crisis is to be more single-minded, more decisive, and less collaborative. And certainly, I think we see that from some leaders. And on the other hand, we have the King's Fund pushing things out from Michael West and Susie Bailey about compassionate leadership. Now, I think it's fairly clear that the default under pressure is to resort to a more directive, hierarchical form of interaction with people. How do you balance that, Nick, I guess, particularly through leading your organisation at the moment? How do you balance those things? And do you recognise both, I guess, is the other thing? Yeah,
I mean, I would say, so I'm not the only leader of my organisation, let's be clear. I have a, you know, I'm one of the leaders, but so I don't want to take all the credit for leading this organisation in reality. So Al Mully, who came to the last NextGen conference, he didn't speak, but was around. He's written, he's a professor of general practice at Dartmouth University, and if you ever get a chance to hear him speak, he's a legend in reality, just behind Oliver, let's be clear, but no, they're there. And what he says is you can't judge the outcome of a decision made, I won't get this right because I wasn't ready for, you can't judge the outcome of a decision made under stress by the result it produces. And if you think about that, you know that's true. It's because what you're taught about the Berlin principle says that you can make the right decision, but it can produce the wrong outcome. And so there are people now that are having to make decisions, and I think they will retrospectively will look back and say that wasn't the best decision. Okay, but you can judge the decision by how much input you get into how you made that decision. So you can be decisive in how you make a decision, but if you're making that decision in isolation, then you're in a tricky place, really. So, and that doesn't mean you ask everybody. You've got to be careful who you do ask to get that input. But if you've made a decision, so that's important. You really do need to make some decisions in this scenario. You know, in this season we're in, decision making is really important. But the decision making in isolation, that's the thing which will define whether it's a good or a bad decision, because the outcome is more tricky. Now, so I mean, we know that clinically, don't we? Because, you know, I can think of, you know, I've been a GP 20 years. I can think of drugs that we prescribed 20 years ago that we just don't prescribe anymore because we believe now they cause more harm than they do good. Does that mean I made a bad decision previously? No, I applied the best evidence that I had at the time. I took insight from around it. So, yeah, we've got to make decisions. I think people are looking more for people that will say, describe where we're going, which is just decision making. So I think that's true, but I think we've got to balance that with an understanding of how we've made the decisions more than anything else. So I still think that applies, and applies just as much now.
And I'd suggest that we need to distinguish between being decisive and being dictatorial. They're not the same thing. And we can be decisive, but still have buy-in by how effectively we explain the thinking behind our decision. To actually say, if we had all the time in the world, I'd have loved for us to have had days discussing this. But time's on our side, and this is what I've decided. Here's my thinking behind it as we go along. And I think these are very humbling times, because when we implement the decisions that we make, it's implementation as learning, because things happen out there that we just, when we get lucky, we we take that on board. When things go horrendously, we blame others. No, I'm facetious. So,
well, can I pick up on that, Oliver? Because I think it ties. So there are two things from Sonali and Hannah, who are next gen leaders. You'll know them both. Sonali picks up on the point of doing that. There's been a lot of very rapid change, speed over precision and perfection, but there's a risk to that, and there's a risk that comes in trying to do everything super fast, and there's, I guess, she points out an emotional burden associated with doing that, constantly feeling like you're trying to building the bridge behind you. I don't know what the cartoon metaphor is, where they run off the side of a cliff and they're still trying to create the bridge. And Hannah Morgan asked about how we create, how we capture the learning that you just described happening. So there's a bit about how do we continue to do everything we think is necessary yesterday and keep ourselves sane and healthy, and how do we capture the learning from this, because there's bound to be loads of rich learning happening at practice and PCM level and everywhere else.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of it feels like the Wallace and Gromit moment, doesn't it? Where we're standing on the train and throwing the track down and hoping that's the right piece of track to throw down, and we're going to land on that piece of track and then the next piece, which is the beautiful metaphor which we saw in that cartoon. And, it does feel like that. But the way you capture, so I think the way you capture it is by looking back and see where the track's been and what you've learned in that process. And there are great ways to think about how you capture it. I think, I do write stuff down in terms of me trying to capture where I am. There's something quite important for me about getting a pen out, okay, and writing. I think because of the way that we were taught, and I'm not sure this is right, but because of the way we were taught at university, we were taught that you go to a lecture and you write it down. And so for me, there's a wired-in bit in my brain that says, if you talk to me about it, I won't remember it. Whereas if I write it down and learn about it and reflect on it, like Oliver described, whether that's in the morning or what time you use, that's how I'm going to use my cocoon time to change the beliefs of who I am. I suspect for those of you that they've got small children, have realised, homeschooling was an interesting thing that suddenly got thrown upon a whole bunch of us that we weren't. I mean, my kids are a bit older, but we actually learned quite a lot about ourselves and about our kids and what really, really presses our buttons, because our family members tend to do that. And if you haven't, it's an interesting opportunity for us to learn new things in those ways. But then making sure that we take that out for the future, I think, is the really important thing about what I've called cocooning, which I've stolen from somebody else, like all good ideas. So, Oliver, what do you want to say about that?
Well, just a tiny bit to add to that, perhaps, is that I think one of the things that we might want to consider is there's a sense in which everything is storytelling. So let me explain.
Please do.
An accountant's numbers that don't tell a clear story are not good numbers. And architects' drawings that don't tell a clear story of the vision and how it's going to be materialized are not good drawings. A report is a story in retrospect. A plan is a story in prospect. What's happening now is a story in progress. So there's something about us being more attentive to our own individual stories. Let me say to everyone on this webinar, your past is full of rich stuff that is begging to be understood. And so for me, one of the things that I'm interested in doing is not just to say what's worked well, but to actually say what have been some of my most value-creating failures and mistakes. What learning opportunities have those things created for me? So that it's not just regret and recrimination, in terms of looking back, self-recrimination, but it's actually harvesting them in terms of learning. So your plans are a story, even short-term plans. Your reports are stories, and the present is a story in the making, unfolding.
Thank you both. Lucy down in Devon, she's a GP registrar down in Devon, has said she likes Nick's analogy with the cocoon. Lucy
Thanks,
asked,
Lucy. I did steal it, so I just heard it and thought it was great. So.
well, Oliver would say that's borrowed brilliance, Nick. He didn't steal it. Lucy asks, for those of us feeling grief about the emotion at the enormous loss and changes in our roles or our projects, do you have any advice on how to redirect our energy and seize new opportunities as they come available to us?
Who do you want to go?
Well, Oliver, why don't you start us on this time?
Okay. Well, no simple answers, I suppose, but one of the things to think about is to distinguish between, so for myself now, I don't always ask, what is your job? I ask people, what are you paid to contribute? And sometimes it leads to quite a fruitful conversation. So there's something about you as a person who happens to be a doctor. What is the contribution, the valued contribution that you tend to make? What are some of the signature contributions that by you being in the room, stuff happens that is you magic? What is that? Because that is stuff we'll be able to take into other jobs, other spheres even. So I think being attentive to the value-creating contribution that you bring is one thing to possibly think about.
So I think it's really helpful, Lucy, you called it grief. Okay, let's just, because again, there's a truth in calling it what it is. Not last year, the year before, my mother passed away, and I was just trying to process that in a healthy way. I found really difficult because, you know, I could describe the stages of grief and loss to my patients in terms of, you know, denial, anger, you know, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And what I realized more than anything is that, yes, those things happen. And rather than talk about them to patients and saying, this is okay, I realized that this is what I was going through, but how you go through it is such a personal thing. And so, Lucy, I won't say to you personally how you go through those things, but call it grief is really, really helpful. But understanding grief that it is, you have to go through some personal stuff in that. Secondly, it's unpredictable. You know, I was really busy around my mother's funeral, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be too busy. I just think it's helpful to think about it in this way. And then I had a couple of days off, and I was like, right, now I need to have a really good cry, a really good grief. And it was just like, I can't, and you know, and so the unpredictability of it is quite tricky. So realizing that, you know, I think a lot of us have been in denial. There was, you know, denial in terms of, you know, is this really going to affect us, this country, in this way? Is it really going to mean we've got to be on lockdown, all those things? There's anger, you know, which unbelievably expressed itself in buying toilet rolls, which everybody else was going, why are we doing that? You know, but that's what the country did. And then there's kind of bargaining, you know, if we stay here long enough, will we get this back? All those things, and you see that going on, and then, you know, there's pure low mood associated with it, and, you know, in some ways accepting that is how you get through it. And then probably just saying, are you going to believe for a better day? Are you going to think about, you know, what are the stories of the past where you've been through those things that you can use those to help yourself for the future? So that's what I've done. And to say, you know, for me, I can tell stories of my grandfather and my father who lived through things. And my father, I can still ring up and say, you know, in 1969, when you lived through this and you were the RMO of the local hospital, what was it like? And then he would say, but we're here now, and this is, you know, this is where we are. So realizing that it's grief, I think, is really helpful. Being able to say goodbye properly to the things that you need to say goodbye to, but also being able to say, do you know what, that there is a new future coming which is different, and let's hope that we are able to live differently. You know, someone someone said to me, isn't it amazing that Mother Nature, for years we've been saying we can't change our fossil fuel consumption, we can't change anything because we've got to live like this. And Mother Nature, if you believe in Mother Nature or whatever you believe, has decided that a small round thing that's spiky means that none of us now travel. And so, there are maps of bits of the world that are completely changing as a consequence of our carbon footprint changing. And I'm like, gosh, isn't that interesting that you can see those changes? And how do we make sure that we, do well with that in the future? Not just me individually, but us as a population. We've taken a walk at most evenings where we can do, and how pleasurable has that been? And am I going to keep doing that? And we play games in the evening as a family, and we're going to keep doing those things. So it's accepting those things, but being honest about the grief and the process.
Thank you, Nick. I'd like to come back to the thinking forward beyond this in a bit, if that's okay.
Sure.
Steph Pete said that rather than calling it a cocoon, that her family are calling it a hibernation. Squirrels in the house. Certainly matches my experience so far. Liz says, in response, I guess, to Lucy's question, is sometimes I wonder if actually we have to refocus and just do our job. A step back from all the other projects and personal developments during this time, actually might be the right thing and is okay. I'm going to come back. I'd like to come back to you though on Aaron's question. Aaron Popperton, he's a GP up in Blackburn. He's one of our NextGen leaders in Lancashire. He says, have you got any advice on overcoming imposter syndrome, particularly during this period of crisis? I suppose for lots of people, that redirection of projects that Lucy was talking about might involve stepping up in a different way and taking on more responsibility, or at least having to view themselves as leaders in a different way. Have you got any thoughts on imposter syndrome in that specific context?
Oliver.
Oh God, you're going to make me choose. Oliver.
Yeah. He will have.
Well, as you're aware, imposter syndrome is a phenomenon where people struggle with owning or internalizing or identifying with their own contribution and success. There's always an explanation for it. Like, I just got lucky. I happened to be in the right place at the right time. I'm not anything like as smart as they think I am, and sooner than later I'm going to be found out. I prefer to relabel it imposter moments, because even the two psychologists who first coined the term said that it was a bit of a mistake for it to be called syndrome because it almost medicalizes it. And whereas with a moment, you can actually, you can get over it, you can use it for other things. So some of the things that can be helpful with imposter syndrome, one is to think about things like the growth mindset that Carol Dweck researched and has been finding in where the thing is not, I'm not good enough for this, but I can't yet do this well, but I'm working on. The not yet is a really interesting concept. And then there's someone who, the progress principle, which is another piece of research, which is really interesting, where they're saying that one of the most powerful things in the workplace in terms of engagement is people having the sense that they're making progress in meaningful work. And I think, her name doesn't come to mind right now, but I'll make it available to Will and Nish afterwards. And I think there's some very practical things we can do. We need to challenge our own mindsets. And on the imposter syndrome thing, there's something about, if it is not helping you, is it harming you, that imposter syndrome thing? And if it is harming you and you keep on doing it, when does it become self-harm? So I think we need to have a learning and growth posture, which says, I have not arrived, but I'm going to celebrate that which has happened so far. And finally, when you get into meetings with people who are highly accomplished, what do you do about making sure that their accomplishment and brilliance does not diminish you, but inspires you? Because it is so easy to allow ourselves to be threatened and diminished by others' greatness, and we only see where we lack. Nick.
Yeah, whatever he said. It was great. I mean, it was great, wasn't it? And I was just reflecting on how many moments have I walked into rooms, you know, outside of this environment where I felt like, should you really be here? You know, and actually knowing that, you know, the contribution I bring is Nick Harding, and you know, let's use it as a plug for, you know, Hannah, who Oliver and I both know very well. Realizing the strengths of what you bring to something, and me spending time working out what that was like for me, and I'm sure Hannah will talk about that from in the seminar that you're doing next with her. That's the thing I sit here thinking. Yeah, but you might have more letters after your name than before your name, and more letters before your name than anybody has ever invented, and you might be really, really important, but actually you're just Nick.
Mm.
And the question is, do you know what Nick does well? Because
Yeah.
I'm trying to work out what I do well, and that's part of me dealing with my the moments where I'm going, gosh, I feel like I'm going to get found out, and making sure that I'm trying to get found out as me. Because if I get found out as me, that's all right.
Well, and Will mentioned the thing about brilliance is borrowed. For me, that really came to life when I was invited to become one of the a commissioner on one of the commissions the government set up to look into how the range and quality of how our businesses and organizations are owned in the UK, and how that might help us with getting out of recessions. This was quite a few years ago. And when I saw the names of the people on the list, the other 12 people, I thought, after you've said, hello, my name is so-and-so, what do you say? Do you say anything at all? And then I thought, whose thinking do I regard and respect? And so I went to those people and I said, I'm not going to divulge to you the secrets of these meetings and the confidences of the meetings, but I want you to know the agenda items and tell me, if you were in the room, what 2 questions would you ask and why? So I wanted to borrow their brains, and that helped me.
Good question, Aaron. I liked it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we've got some more great questions coming in. So I got one that's, well, they're slightly, I won't try and link them. Anna Reid, who's one of our leaders in Wessex, who is her birthday tomorrow. Happy birthday, Anna. Has asked,
hey, Anna, happy
birthday.
She'll be very embarrassed about that. She's really enjoyed hearing you talk about how you're managing this. She asked if you would be able to share a moment of vulnerability that you've had, and how you dealt with it. It's a difficult question, so I understand. But Nick, I wonder. I mean, you've shared a bit around the conversation with your paramedic colleague, but can you reflect on in those moments how you frame them and how you try and come back from it, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, in that conversation, you know, if you've got someone like that who is in reality bawling their eyes out on the phone because they're terrified about the fact that tonight they're going to have to go and do their job, then, you know, I just said to the guy, I hear what he's saying, you know, and I said to him, look, you know, I'm really careful I don't use his name, so I'm telling the story in my head and go, don't say his name, don't say his name, and just say, you know, actually, I feel that I had a tear in my eye with his tears whilst he was worried, but you know, and then there's the moment where I put the phone down and I'm thinking, right, what? And in that time I've been on the phone, I've got 15 emails that I've now got to answer with people asking me things which are nothing like this. So it's taking a moment and saying that individual that's had an effect on me. What does that look like? And again, Roger Naylor was legendary in terms of the consultation model of saying, what does housekeeping look like for you? What does it look like for me? Does it mean that actually I walk out of the room that I'm in and go for a walk, or just doing those things? And for me, it didn't mean that in that moment, but it meant sitting thinking. It meant thinking, how do I get closure on that? Not closure to remove it, but closure to say, I'm dealing with my stuff in that, and taking time, to do that. And it's kind of, I think it's the same stuff that we do when we're doing, back-to-back consultations. It's the housekeeping that Roger Naylor really did talk about, to say, have you got, he used the term icons, didn't he, in terms of having things which anchor you to get you back to where you need to be the next profession you are. So I would say that was a moment I can think of one I'm having every day, really, where you've got a staff member that you're trying to be compassionate with and do the right thing, or you've got and just for me, owning that, acknowledging that, and being real in that situation.
Can I turn us towards what comes next? I mean, there are some more questions. We'll come back to them, but I don't want to lose this, because Oliver sort of described thinking 2-3 months ahead as the new strategic thinking, and it does feel like that. It feels that we're so immersed in now, but there will be a time after this when we and those around us have a little less to give. We will have lower energy reserves, because I think we're all using some of that at the moment. Yeah. Some will have experienced significant losses, as you said, Nick. How do we go about supporting and leading people after this? And when do we start thinking about that? When is it right to start thinking about that?
Oliver.
I suppose that's a good thing. For those of us who are thinking about these questions, I think it's helpful to realize that it's almost like we are trying to do dry dock work at sea during a hurricane. And so it's hideously challenging. But I would suggest part of what it's about is actually better understanding what replenishes us, and what replenishes you as an individual, but also realizing that you're not sufficient for the task on your own. So who might you tap into in your ecosystem, even if it is not in the sense of getting solutions to problems, but just by way of talking things out. So to me, I think there's something about what might hygiene look like. So let me give you an example. Right now, I'm supporting a couple of people in New York who are whose businesses are in serious trouble because of what's going on. And last week, some of the conversations we were having, I just thought, I mean, how do I even begin to understand anything of this? And so my main contribution had to be trying to come up with questions that facilitated their own thinking. They were not in a place yet to begin to think about the future and about strategy, but we just started kind of gently nursing around that. And so, like Nick was saying, there's something about what is the truth of this whole thing, although we don't have the facts. The truth is our past is important, our future is important, the immediate is important, and all three are crucial. And we need to, in a paradoxical way, live in all three time zones at the same time. So I think we need to dig deep in terms of really capturing those wonderful stories from our past that we haven't. I mean, like Nick told us these stories about his father and his granddad. My suggestion is for everyone listening right now, you have stories that are begging to be articulated. And that's a reservoir of strength. And when we look back and we're able to tap into what's worked well, that gives us strength to think about the future in ways that have courage and push forward. So it's thinking at an individual level, and it's thinking at a you're the leaders of today and of the future, and then yes, there's something about how is innovation going to be facilitated in you individually and in groups. And my favorite definition of innovation is something that hasn't been done here before, is by Everett Rogers. And I love it in the sense that it doesn't suggest something that's never been done before, but it says something that's not been done here before.
Thank you, Oliver. It's another paradox, isn't it? You know, looking back and creating stories in order to look forwards.
Yeah.
But thank you for that. We're running short on time, and we've still got loads of questions. Nafiz Fahmi Ali has reflected on Nick talking about Roger Neighbour's model. She said she was thinking about Hellman's model and finds that in context of imposter syndrome, she finds it helpful to ask the questions that Hellman articulated. What's happened? Why has it happened? Why to me? Why now? And what would happen if nothing was done about it? What should I do about it? And we'll share some of those, but that's an interesting take. The last question then, Omar has asked whether either of you have something that you can recommend in terms of reading or a particularly eye-opening or useful resource. And Emma has been admiring Oliver's bookshelf and has asked if he could pick out a particular title to recommend. Oliver, should we start with your bookshelf?
No, let's start with Nick. Well, I think.
Good. Nick, have you got anything?
So it's a resource or something. So what am I doing? I'm reading a book about. Gosh, it's going to sound so spotty. I'm reading a book about what it was like in the Yugoslavian war, and I'm reading it to try and say, what's the learning there in that moment, which things where people have found things pretty tricky, and so I suspect it doesn't matter what you read; it matters more how you read it in reality. Now, obviously, it does matter what you read, because if you read certain things, they're not going to help you at all. But I think the interesting thing for me is the posture of how I read. I've got, if I look at the books beside me to read, I've got Lencioni's book, The Advantage, which I wanted to read for ages. I've got a book called Tribe of Mentors by Timothy Ferris. I've got a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which will tell you about some things that I'm trying to make sure that I'm not going to do. So those are titles that I wanted to read. I'm listening to a lot more podcasts than I probably have had time to do. I've created space to listen to those. But usually they're ones that I've known about already. And so, sort of general leadership podcasts. I guess the trick is to say, some wise person once said to me, there's a transaction you get when you read a book, which is about 8 hours. That's how long it takes to read it, about £10. That's the cost it is. And then the question is, are you going to read it, or are you going to let it read you and change you in that process? And so that wise person was Oliver. And so I try and do that and try and say, how's this transforming me in that process? So a few titles, if that's helpful for you, but I suspect the stuff that I'm going to read may not be that interesting to other people, and so I wouldn't, what I would hate is to say, in the 80s there was a thing of, all the best leaders get up at a certain time, they drive red cars, they drink 3 cups of coffee for breakfast, they all read these books, and the reality is that's what certain people did, but it didn't make them great leaders.
Yeah.
And so I can tell you what I'm reading if you're interested, but that doesn't make you great. It's more about what you're doing with it and how you're doing it, I think. So, yeah, that would be my reflection. Now, Oliver, what do you want to say that's more wise?
No, more wise is not true. Well, before I mention, I suggest one or two books. Let me ask each person on here to think of this. You are a leader. If you were to put your name in this title of a book that's not been written yet, which is, let's say, who shall we pick on? That let's pick on someone. Let's pick on Hannah. Hannah, where you open this first. So if we could say Hannah's leadership in 8 chapters, and you were capturing your journey so far of leadership in 8 chapters, what would those 8 chapters have by way of titles? And what would be the challenges, the struggles, and the lessons learned? So I'm encouraging everyone to start with your book, because you've been writing that book. Although it's not published in paper or digitally, it's published as you walk and serve as a nation. So that's one thing. And my own view is that any book that's waiting for me to read, that person works for me, and they just can't wait to make me better as I argue with them in the reading. So, as Nick said, it's more about how you read the books, how you pick up arguments with the writers, because however wonderful it is, that was their current best thinking at the time. And I find it helpful to have arguments with the authors I buy.
Oliver, sorry to interrupt you. Are there any particular role models though that you would pick out for leaders at a time of crisis, or otherwise, who you found particularly, whose style or learning you found particularly resonating with you recently?
As I said, the life of Stockdale is interesting to me in the sense of how he survived the Vietnamese situation, but also I find the paradox of time and interesting, or the time paradox of it, by Zimbardo. I find that really interesting because I think it's useful in this thing of how we live with the past, present, and future in an intentional way, and because this could be used to redefine our relationship with time, and then finally there's the time mastery. There's the title of a book by Clemens, Clemens, Clemens and Dalrymple. And part of what they talk about there is Chronos time and what's the other type of time? Kairos and Chronos, where they're saying actually Chronos is chronological time, and Kairos is things we hadn't planned for or quite anticipated, and how we need to learn to live with both. And they give the example of Intel. It's captured in the little book "Only the Paranoid Survive," which is about strategy. That was Kairos time. Things that hadn't prepared for, pre-planned, how to take advantage of that. So in each of our lives, there's both Chronos time and Kairos time, and how do we live with both?
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for sending. So we will work out a way of sharing some of the comments, because there's been a stream of really insightful comments and questions coming through, which we haven't had a chance to answer all of. We will Nick and I were talking earlier, and we decided that one of the key metrics of success for this would be if there seemed to be interest in answering more questions, and there certainly have been more. But those that we've touched on, I hope you found them as interesting and thought-provoking as I have. I have written down far too much to summarise my key learning outcomes or my learning points from this. But we will send out some thoughts, and I'm sure some of you have been putting those on Twitter. So it just remains. Oh yeah, Oliver, go for it. Yeah.
Could I ask if each person who's with us right now to think of 2 or 3 things that you are taking away with you that you might want to experiment with from tonight, so that it doesn't just evaporate. Just think of 1 to 3 things that you might want to play around with, and think of 1 to 2 people that you might want to exchange ideas with over the next week or so to cement it.
Thank you. I'm trying to see if I can work out a way of letting everyone share their chat, but I think it may be beyond me at this moment, although maybe one of my co-hosts can help with that. Maybe we could put some of those on the thread if you felt like sharing them. Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, and I think that'd be really useful. Yeah, thank you both. Thank you again to NextGen leaders Nish and Bex, who have been keeping the show really running over this period of uncertainty. Thank you to James and Emma for helping get these webinars up and running. We've got our next session on the 6th of May with Hannah Miller. Those of you who have done StrengthsFinder with her will know that she's an absolute gem, and there is no one we could better ask to follow these 2 stalwarts of leadership thinking. Please do send questions for that in advance if you'd like to our email info@nextgenerationgp.co.uk. We will be putting together a sort of a brief script based on your questions for the first 20-25 minutes before opening it up to questions like this. There are the sign up is through the same link as before, so bit.ly/nextgenwebinars, which is case sensitive. I didn't realise. Please do sign up for that, and we will have more to bring you in various other formats. We're excited to share those with you soon. In the meantime, please do reflect if you have a chance now before getting back to your glass of wine or whatever, as Oliver has challenged us to. And if you could please fill out a brief, very, very brief feedback form. I've put the links on the chat. I'll email them round. Just 2 minutes. What have you learned? Any messages you'd like us to pass back to Oliver and Nick? We'll have to censor anything obscene. And but we would really value that. As you know, we really seek to improve these things as we go through. Thank you so many of you for joining us tonight. It's been a real treat to feel connected to the NextGen family again, which is certainly something that has kept me feeling positive for the last couple of weeks. So thank you for everything you're doing, for your patients, for your families, for yourselves. Please look after yourselves, and we're going to make primary care an incredibly exciting place to be working when this is all finished. Thank you.